The laughter started before I even reached my seat. I am Commander Daniel Hart, and I had walked into that council chamber 100 times before, but never once had the air felt like this. 40 tiers of alien delegates looked down at me and my small human delegation as if we were something they had found stuck to the bottom of a boot. The Carthian speaker, a tall creature named Thralon with skin like cracked stone, raised one long arm and pointed it straight at our table. "Humanity," he said, his translator voice flat and cold, "is an unfinished experiment, a species that crawled out of its own ashes and mistook survival for achievement." The chamber erupted. Not every species could laugh the way humans laugh, but the sound that rolled down those tiers needed no translation. It was mockery, pure and simple, and it hit me harder than any weapon ever had. I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. Beside me, Ambassador Marcus Doyle did not move at all. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Thralon, and said nothing. I leaned toward him. "Sir, they are about to vote." "I know," he whispered back. "Let them." The vote came fast, almost too fast, as if they had already written the result before the session even began. Provisional status. No fleet. No voice on the defense table. No vote on anything that mattered. Humanity would sit in that chamber for the next decade as a guest who was never quite welcome, watched and managed like a child who could not be trusted with anything sharp. I watched the gavel drone hover over its podium and chime once, sealing our fate into law. Around the chamber, delegates from a dozen worlds exchanged looks of satisfaction. The Vex representative, a quiet being who rarely showed emotion, allowed herself the smallest curve of her mouth. Even that small gesture from her felt like a blade sliding into my chest. Ambassador Doyle stood up slowly. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply said one word. "Noted." Then he turned and walked out of the chamber, and I followed him, my spine straight, my face calm, even though inside me, something had gone very quiet and very dangerous. Outside the chamber doors, the station corridor stretched ahead of us, lined with glass windows showing the slow turn of 2 moons. Diplomats from other species passed us in 2s and 3s, some of them whispering, some of them openly smiling at our defeat. I waited until we were alone before I spoke. "Sir, that resolution strips us of everything we came here to protect." Doyle did not slow his pace. "I know exactly what it strips us of, Commander." "Then why didn't you fight it?" He stopped walking and turned to face me. His eyes were sharp, almost amused, in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Because some fights are not won with words in a room like that one," he said. "Get some rest. Tonight you are going to need it." I did not understand what he meant until 3 hours later, sitting alone in my quarters, when my private comm device lit up with a message that should not have existed. It was routed through a channel buried so deep in our encrypted network that even most of Fleet Command did not know it was active. The message had only one line. "Oracle's debt is inbound. Arrival in Threll orbit at 0600. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands were not steady anymore. I had heard that name only once before, 4 years earlier, in a closed session so secret that half the people in the room had to surrender their personal devices at the door. It was not a warship by any definition the Alien Council understood, because the Council had never imagined a ship like it could exist. We had built it far past Jupiter, in yards hidden behind a name so boring that no analyst from any species ever thought to look twice. Agricultural Logistics Platform 7. There was nothing agricultural about it. There was no platform in the way anyone meant that word. It was 11 kilometers of patience, of anger compressed into engineering, of every insult humanity had swallowed over 30 years turned into steel and fire. And it was 6 hours from arriving above the very station where we had just been laughed out of a vote. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Somewhere outside this room, in a chamber full of delegates who thought the matter was settled, nobody had any idea what was about to happen to their dawn. I should have felt afraid. Instead, something colder and steadier moved through me. The same feeling I remembered from training exercises right before a mission began, when fear turns into focus, and focus turns into purpose. I got up, dressed in silence, and walked to the observation deck, because I knew I would not sleep. not with that message glowing behind my eyes. The deck was empty except for one figure standing at the long viewport, watching the dark beyond the station glass. It was Ambassador Doyle. He did not turn around when I approached. "You got the message," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "Then you understand why I said noted instead of fighting for something in that chamber." I stood beside him, watching the slow drift of stars beyond the glass. "Sir, this changes everything. The moment that ship arrives, every species in this system is going to assume we are declaring war." "Let them assume," he said quietly. "Assumptions are not the same as truth, and tomorrow morning every delegate in that chamber is going to learn the difference the hard way." I wanted to ask him more, but something in his voice told me the conversation was over for now. We stood there together in silence, two humans staring out at a black sky that, in a few short hours, would no longer look the same to anyone watching it. Behind us, the station hummed quietly, with its usual late-night rhythm, oblivious. Engineers walked past on routine patrols. A pair of Carthian guards stood near the far end of the corridor, laughing about something in their own language, still riding high on the victory their delegation had won that afternoon. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Because somewhere out past the edge of this system, an 11-kilometer ship that had no business existing under any treaty they had ever written, was already cutting through the dark, closing the distance, carrying with it 30 years of silence that was about to end. And not one of them, not the Carthian speaker, not the smiling Vex delegate, not a single laughing voice from that chamber, had the faintest idea that dawn was going to arrive carrying something far heavier than sunlight. I checked the chrono on the wall. 5 hours and 40 minutes remained. I had never in my life felt time move so slowly and so fast at once. The hours that followed did not feel real. I returned to my quarters but could not sit still, so I paced instead, going over every detail of that afternoon's vote in my mind, replaying the laughter, replaying the speaker's words, replaying the gavel drone sealing our fate with a single clean chime. At some point I must have dozed, because I woke with a jolt when my comm device buzzed again. This time it was not a secret channel. It was an open station alert, the kind every delegation received automatically, warning of unusual sensor activity at the edge of the system. I was on my feet and moving before I had even finished reading it. Outside my door, the corridor was no longer quiet. Station staff hurried past in both directions, voices low and urgent, eyes darting toward the viewports as if they expected to see something there already, even though whatever was coming remained far beyond the reach of human sight. I found Ambassador Doyle exactly where I expected him to be, back on the observation deck, hands folded behind him, watching the dark. "It's starting," I said. He nodded once. "Then let's not be anywhere else when it does." I stood beside him as the first reports filtered through the open channels, fragments of alien chatter not meant for our ears, but available anyway, because in moments of panic, species tend to forget who might be listening. A Carthian fleet officer was demanding clarification from station sensors. Something large had registered at the very edge of detection range, and the operators kept insisting it had to be a sensor ghost, an error, a comet that had wandered off its expected path. It was not a comet. I watched the numbers scroll past on the public display feed, numbers that made no sense to the people reading them, because nothing in the galaxy was supposed to move that quietly while carrying that much mass. 6 minutes passed in complete silence from the unidentified object. 6 minutes in which every fleet officer on that station recalculated the same readings over and over, hoping for a different answer and getting the same impossible one each time. I felt my pulse climbing, not from fear, but from something closer to anticipation, the kind soldiers feel in the final seconds before an operation begins. Ambassador Doyle did not move. He simply watched the dark beyond the glass, waiting, as if he already knew exactly what shape was about to appear there. And then it did. The Oracle's debt did not arrive with fire or sound. It simply existed where nothing had existed a moment before. 11 kilometers of dark hull sliding into high orbit above the station, with no warning beacon, no greeting signal, nothing but its own enormous, undeniable presence. For a long moment, nobody on that station said anything at all. I broke the silence first, because someone had to. "Sir, sensors confirm it. That is our ship." Ambassador Doyle finally turned away from the viewport. and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to relief cross his face, quickly buried under the same calm mask he always wore. "Good," he said. Then it arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Around us, the station was no longer calm. Alarms I had never heard before were sounding through the lower decks, a rising pulse of warning tones meant to alert every species docked there that something unscheduled and unexplained had entered their orbit. Voices on a dozen open channels overlapped each other, demanding identification, demanding explanation, demanding that someone, anyone, tell them what they were looking at. A young station technician ran past us, nearly colliding with a Carthian officer coming the other way. Neither of them stopped to apologize. Fear has a way of erasing manners faster than almost anything else. I turned to Doyle. "They are going to think we are attacking them. Let them think that for exactly as long as it takes them to remember who taught them to be afraid of silence in the first place," he said. I did not fully understand what he meant. Not yet, but I would before the night was over. A new voice cut through the open channel, sharp and demanding, speaking in Carthian first, and then in the universal translation layer a half-second later. It was Fleet Commander Thralon's military counterpart, a Carthian officer named Vosik, requesting immediate identification of the unknown vessel, under threat of defensive engagement. My stomach tightened. If their fleet opened fire first, against a ship that size, the consequences would be impossible to predict or control. Doyle did not seem worried. He activated his own comm device, calm as ever, and opened a channel that I recognized instantly, because it was not aimed at any single delegation. It was council-wide. Every ear in that system, human and otherwise, was about to hear what he said next. "Humanity withdraws its silence," he said. 4 words spoken without anger, without threat, almost gently. Then he closed the channel and said nothing more. I stared at him. "That's it? That's the whole message?" "That's the whole message," he said. "Sometimes the fewer words you use, the louder they sound afterward." Within minutes, the chatter across every open frequency changed completely. Where before there had been demands and confusion, now there was something closer to dread. I listened, as alien officers from 3 different fleets tried to make sense of 4 simple words, turning them over, searching for hidden meaning, finding none, and somehow being more afraid because of it. It was during this chaos that I noticed someone approaching from the far end of the observation deck, moving carefully, glancing over her shoulder more than once. It was Soray, the quiet Vex delegate who had allowed herself that small smile during our humiliation in council, only hours earlier. She did not look amused now. "Commander Hart," she said quietly, her translator voice low enough that it would not carry far. "May I speak with you?" I glanced at Doyle, who gave the smallest nod, granting permission without saying a word. "Of course," I said. Soray stepped closer, her dark eyes flicking toward the viewport where the Oracle's debt sat in silent orbit. "I voted for the resolution against your species today," she said. "I want you to know I regret it now, watching this." I kept my voice steady. "Regret will not change the vote, Ambassador." "No," she agreed, "but it might change what happens next, if your people are willing to listen." I studied her carefully. The Vex were not known for sentiment, and certainly not for confessing political mistakes to the species they had just helped humiliate. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice further. "The Carthian fleet is preparing a defensive posture around the station. Commander Vosik believes your ship's arrival is the opening move of an attack, and he intends to authorize a strike before that ship can deploy whatever weapons it might be carrying." My pulse spiked. "When?" "Soon," she said. "Faster than your ambassador may expect." I turned immediately to Doyle, who had clearly heard every word, despite standing several paces away. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "I know. If the Carthian fleet fires first." "I know," he said, "which is exactly why our ship is not going to give them the chance to decide that question for themselves." He raised his comm device again, this time opening a direct line to a frequency I did not recognize, one that connected, I realized a moment later, straight to the bridge of the Oracle's debt itself. The voice that answered was calm, almost bored, belonging to a woman I had never met, but whose name I would learn soon enough. "Captain Owen Brooks here. Go ahead, Ambassador." Doyle's voice did not waver. "Captain, the local fleet is preparing a strike. You are cleared to demonstrate capability. No engagement." Capability only. There was a brief pause on the line. Understood, Ambassador. Demonstrating now. I felt the deck tremble faintly beneath my boots, not from any weapon firing, but from something far stranger, a vibration that seemed to pass through the station's hull itself, as if the Oracle's debt had just exhaled. Outside the viewport, the massive ship's weapon bays began to open, not one or two, but every visible bay along its enormous hull, dozens of them sliding apart in perfect unison, revealing nothing but dark, waiting space behind them. No shots were fired, no projectiles launched. The bays simply opened, fully powered, fully locked, targeting solutions painted silently across every alien warship in orbit at once. The effect on the open comm channels was immediate and total. Voices that had been shouting demands a moment earlier fell into stunned, ragged silence. Somewhere on the Carthian Fleet channel, I heard Commander Vosik's voice crack as he ordered his crews to hold position, hold fire, hold everything. Soray watched the scene with an expression I could not quite read. "That is not an attack," she murmured. "No," I agreed. "It's a question, and it's waiting for an answer." Doyle finally allowed himself the smallest, coldest smile I had ever seen on his face. "Then I suggest the Council reconvene immediately, before someone makes the mistake of answering it wrong." The emergency session was called within 20 minutes, faster than any session I had ever attended on that station. There was no formal announcement, no ceremony, no opening remarks from the usual rotating chair. Delegates simply arrived, pale and hurried, taking their seats under the weight of dozens of targeting locks still glowing silently on every fleet display screen across the system. I walked back into that chamber beside Ambassador Doyle, and this time nobody laughed. The Carthian speaker, Thralon, sat rigid in his seat, his stone-colored skin somehow looking paler than it had only hours earlier. Beside him, Commander Vosik stood near the military advisory rail, his posture stiff, his eyes flicking again and again toward the chamber's single large viewport, where the curve of the Oracle's debt was visible, even from inside the station, blotting out a portion of the stars like a held breath. Doyle did not wait for permission to speak. He walked straight to the podium where, 12 hours earlier, he had been called an unfinished experiment, and he placed both hands flat on its surface. "I will not waste this chamber's time with speeches," he began, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "You have already heard everything you need to hear from the ship currently holding position above this station. I am only here to explain what happens next." Thralon found his voice first, though it came out thinner than before. "This is an act of aggression against the Compact Council. You will answer for it." Doyle's expression did not change. "No shots have been fired, Speaker Thralon. No hull has been damaged. No life has been lost. I would ask you to consider very carefully whether the word aggression belongs in this conversation, given what was said about my species in this very chamber yesterday." A ripple of uneasy movement passed through the tiers. Several delegates exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their earlier confidence, now that the numbers on every screen told a very different story than the vote had. "I continued the resolution," Doyle said, "withdraws the provisional status assigned to humanity, effective immediately. In its place, I am presenting a revised treaty framework, one this council will adopt before this session ends." Vosik stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You cannot dictate terms to this council at gunpoint." Doyle turned to face him directly. "I am not dictating terms, Commander. I am simply pointing out that the terms this council dictated to us yesterday were written by people who assumed humanity would never have the means to refuse them. That assumption is no longer accurate, and I think everyone in this room understands exactly why." Nobody answered him. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Soray rose from her seat then, surprising more than a few delegates around her. "I move that the council consider the revised framework," she said, her voice steady, despite the tension thick enough to choke on. "We voted in haste yesterday. I will not pretend otherwise." A murmur rolled through the chamber, equal parts shock and reluctant agreement. The Vex rarely admitted fault publicly, and her words seemed to crack something loose in the room, a permission for others to reconsider without losing face entirely. Thralon's hands tightened on the rail in front of him. "This sets a dangerous precedent. Any species with enough firepower could force this council's hand the same way." Doyle's reply came fast and sharp. the first real edge I had heard in his voice all day. Then perhaps this council should consider why an entire species felt it necessary to build a ship capable of forcing your hand, rather than simply asking why we built it at all. That landed harder than anything else he had said. I watched several delegates lower their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze, because they all understood the answer to that question without needing it spoken aloud. 30 years of being dismissed, mocked, and managed had not happened in a vacuum. We had not built the Oracle's debt out of ambition. We had built it because patience has a limit, and ours had simply been tested for longer than most species ever survive being tested. The new treaty draft scrolled onto the chamber's central display, line by line, written in language simple enough that even the youngest delegate present could follow every word without confusion. Full fleet parity, full voting rights on every council matter, including matters of defense, and one additional clause, the one Doyle had clearly written with the most care, stating plainly that no member species would describe another, using language designed to humiliate rather than inform. Threlon attempted one final objection, his voice rising with desperation rather than authority now. This requires a full council vote, conducted under standard procedure, not under duress. Doyle let the silence answer for him this time. Above the station, 11 kilometers of patient engineering held its weapon bays open exactly as they had for the last 20 minutes, locked, steady, and utterly unmoved by procedural objections. Threlon's mouth opened again, then closed. He looked toward Vosik, who gave the smallest, most reluctant shake of his head, a silent admission that no military option remained worth attempting against a ship that had not even needed to fire a single shot to make its point. "The objection is withdrawn," Threlon said finally, the words clearly costing him something he would never fully recover. The vote that followed was nothing like the one from the day before. There was no laughter this time, no smiles, no satisfied glances exchanged between delegations who believed they had won something. Hands and translated assent signals rose around the chamber in near total silence, species after species accepting the new framework without further argument, until the gavel drone hovered once more above its podium and chimed, sealing a very different fate into law than the one it had sealed only 12 hours earlier. I stood near the back of the chamber and watched it happen, feeling something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was wound so tight. Sore approached us again as the session began to break apart, delegates rising slowly, many of them still glancing toward the viewport, as if expecting the ship outside to vanish the moment they stopped paying attention. "That was not how I expected today to end," she said quietly. Doyle allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Most days that matter rarely end how anyone expects, Ambassador. That is usually how you know they mattered." I caught Captain Brooks's voice over the comm one final time as we left the chamber, calm and unhurried as ever. "Weapon bays closing, Ambassador. Standing by for further instruction." "Bring her home, Captain," Doyle said, slowly. "Let them watch every second of it." I understood exactly why he wanted that. There was something the Council needed to see beyond the open bays and the silent threat. They needed to watch 11 kilometers of restraint withdraw, without ever once losing its patience, because that, more than any weapon, was the lesson humanity had spent 30 years learning to deliver. I should have known the danger was not over the moment the vote passed. Threats do not vanish simply because a treaty says they should, and I learned that lesson again before the night was finished. We had barely left the chamber, walking back toward the observation deck where this entire ordeal had begun, when my comm device buzzed with an alert that sent ice through my veins. It came from a private channel only a handful of people knew existed, the same one that had warned me about the ship's arrival hours earlier. Unauthorized weapons activation detected. Carthian escort vessel. Designation Vethric. Power signature rising outside approved parameters. I grabbed Doyle's arm before he could take another step. "Sir, one of their ships is arming weapons. It's not part of the main fleet. It's a smaller escort, moving independently." Doyle's comm cracked for the first time that night, just slightly, just enough for me to see it. "Show me." I pulled up the feed on my device, and together we watched a single Carthian vessel break formation from the rest of the fleet, accelerating on a vector that put it directly between the station and the Oracle's debt's current withdrawal path. "This has to be Vosik's doing," I said, "or someone under his command who didn't get the order to stand down." Doyle was already moving, fast, toward the nearest secure comm terminal. "Get Captain Brooks. Now. I opened the channel with hands that were not quite steady. Captain Brooks, this is Commander Hart. We have a Carthian escort breaking formation. Weapons hot. Closing on your withdrawal vector. Brooks's voice came back instantly. Sharper now. All trace of boredom gone. Copy that, Commander. I have it on sensors. Designation Vethric. Single vessel. Escort class. Confirm. Is this an authorized engagement order from the Council? No, Doyle said, taking the comm from my hand. This is not authorized by anyone. Captain, do not return fire under any circumstances. Hold position and broadcast a warning on all open Carthian fleet channels. Understood, Brooks said, broadcasting now. I stood frozen, watching the small icon representing the Vethric continue its approach on the display, while the massive shape of the Oracle's det held perfectly still, refusing to retreat, refusing to fire, simply waiting. Across the open comm, Brooks's voice rang out clear and steady, addressed not to us, but to the approaching vessel directly. Carthian escort Vethric, you are on a collision vector with a vessel currently operating under Council-sanctioned withdrawal. Disengage immediately. This is your only warning. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. I realized I was holding my breath, and beside me, Doyle's jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle working beneath his skin. Then a new voice broke onto the channel, frantic, clearly not the officer who had ordered the escort's launch. This is Lieutenant Eric Bellows aboard the Vethric. Belay previous orders. Belay previous orders. Powering down weapons immediately. We are disengaging. The relief that flooded through me was almost dizzying. On the display, the small icon representing the escort vessel began to slow, then curve away from its collision path, falling back toward the rest of the Carthian fleet formation. Doyle exhaled slowly beside me, the only outward sign that the last 10 minutes had cost him anything at all. Get me Commander Vosik, he said quietly. It took only a minute to establish the connection. Vosik's face appeared on the small display screen, and even through the static of the feed, I could see something close to shame in his expression. That was not an authorized action, Vosik said before Doyle could speak. The officer in command of that escort acted without orders, in violation of the new treaty terms. He will face discipline under our own command structure. Doyle studied him for a long moment. See that he does, Commander. The treaty we signed tonight only holds if both sides honor it completely, not selectively, not when it is convenient. Understood, Vosik said, and for the first time since I had encountered him, his voice carried no trace of arrogance at all. The connection closed, and silence settled over the observation deck once more, broken only by the quiet hum of the station and the slow, steady retreat of the Oracle's det, continuing its withdrawal exactly as Doyle had instructed, unhurried, unshaken, refusing to let one reckless officer's mistake become the spark that undid everything we had just secured. I let myself breathe again, fully, for what felt like the first time in hours. That was close, I said. Doyle nodded once. Closer than I would have liked, but it proved something important. What's that? That restraint is harder to maintain than aggression, he said. Any fool with a weapon can pull a trigger in a moment of fear. It takes something far rarer to hold position and trust that patience will still win the day. Captain Brooks just proved our people have that in them, when it matters most. I thought about that for a long moment, watching the great dark shape of our ship continue its slow retreat beyond the glass. Somewhere far below us, on 100 worlds we would likely never visit, news of tonight's events was already beginning to spread, carried along comm relays and diplomatic channels at the speed every species in the galaxy had learned to fear and respect in equal measure. I had a feeling humanity's name was about to mean something very different tomorrow than it had meant yesterday. The formal closing of the old treaty framework happened just before true dawn, in a small chamber I had never even known existed until that night, tucked away behind the main council hall. Doyle told me it was called the Record Room, the place where every law the council had ever passed was stored in physical form, etched onto thin sheets of a crystalline material that could survive almost anything except deliberate destruction. A council clerk, a small nervous-looking being from a species I did not recognize, carried in the physical record of yesterday's provisional resolution on a polished tray, holding it as carefully as if it might bite her. "This is highly unusual," she said, glancing between Doyle and the small gathering of delegates who had chosen to witness the formal annulment. Records are typically archived, not destroyed. Doyle's voice was calm but final. This record represents an agreement made under false assumptions about what my species was and was not capable of. It should not exist as precedent for the next delegation, foolish enough to consider repeating it. The clerk hesitated only a moment longer before activating the small device built into the tray itself. A thin blue flame rose from its center, consuming the crystalline sheet in seconds, leaving behind nothing but a fine gray residue that drifted upward and dissolved into the chamber's filtration system. I watched it happen, and felt something settle inside me that I had not expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, but something closer to relief, the particular relief that comes after holding your breath for far longer than you realized. By dawn, every treaty signed under the old framework was gone, formally annulled across every system in the Compact's network, replaced by the new terms that recognized humanity as an equal, rather than a guest on probation. Word of it spread faster than I would have believed possible, racing along comm relays from world to world, carried by diplomats and traders and ordinary citizens of a dozen species who had woken to find the balance of power in their galaxy had shifted overnight. I stepped outside onto the station's upper observation ring as the system's actual sun began to rise over the curve of Threll's nearest moon, painting the black of space with the first thin streaks of gold I had seen since arriving. It felt strange to witness something as simple and ordinary as a sunrise, after a night that had reshaped the future of my entire species. Soray found me there again, alone this time, watching the light spread slowly across the station's hull. "You look tired, Commander," she said. I managed a small, honest laugh. "I think everyone on this station looks tired this morning, Ambassador." She stepped closer to the railing beside me, her dark eyes following the slow climb of the sun. "I have served on this council for almost 40 of your years," she said. "I have never witnessed a night like this one. I doubt I ever will again." I considered her words carefully before answering. "Do you regret what happened? The ship, the standoff, all of it?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I do not regret the outcome. Perhaps that is a strange thing to say to the species responsible for it, but it is the truth." I nodded slowly, understanding more than she probably realized. "We did not want it to be necessary either," I said. "We simply ran out of other options." Below us, the Oracle's debt remained in high orbit, smaller now against the brightening sky, its weapon bays long since closed, its presence no longer a threat, but something closer to a quiet promise. I found myself studying its dark hull, thinking about the crew aboard it, men and women who had spent months, maybe years, training for a moment they hoped would never actually arrive, and who had executed it last night without a single shot fired, without a single life lost, with nothing but patience and precision. I wanted to meet them. I told Soray as much, and she gave me a small, knowing look. "Then perhaps you should go find out if that is possible," she said. "I imagine they will not remain in this system for very long." She was right, and I knew it. Within hours, the Council would likely request the ship's departure, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the vessel that had so thoroughly rewritten their assumptions overnight. If I wanted answers, if I wanted to understand exactly what humanity had built and what it had cost to build it, I would need to act quickly. I left the observation deck and made my way toward the station's transport bay, where a small shuttle had been authorized to ferry essential personnel to and from the Oracle's debt during its brief remaining time in orbit. Ambassador Doyle was already there when I arrived, speaking quietly with a station official about departure logistics. He glanced up as I approached. "Going somewhere, Commander?" "I'd like to see the ship, sir, if that's permitted." He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I think you've earned that much. Just remember, what you see aboard that vessel does not leave it, not in any report, not in any conversation, until Fleet Command says otherwise." "Understood, sir." The shuttle ride across the gap between the station and the Oracle's debt took only a few minutes, but it felt much longer, my eyes fixed the entire time on the ship growing larger and larger in the viewport, its dark hull catching the thin morning light in ways that made it look less like a machine and more like something carved from the night itself. We docked in a bay so large it could have swallowed 3 of our standard fleet vessels whole, and I stepped out onto deck plating that hummed faintly beneath my boots, alive with the quiet power of engines still running far below capacity, holding themselves in careful reserve. Captain Owen Brooks met me personally near the docking bay entrance, a woman perhaps a decade older than me, with steady eyes and the kind of calm that I now understood came from genuinely having nothing left to prove. "Commander Hart," she said, extending a hand. "Welcome aboard." "Captain." I shook her hand firmly. "I wanted to thank you, in person, for what you did last night." She offered a small, tired smile. "We didn't do anything except hold still and trust the plan, Commander. That's harder than it sounds, but it's not exactly heroic." "I'd argue otherwise," I said. She gestured for me to walk with her, leading me deeper into the ship along a corridor lined with quiet, focused crew members going about their duties as if the events of the past several hours had been routine, rather than history-altering. "You want to know what it cost," she said, not quite a question. "I do." She was quiet for a moment as we walked. "Years," she said finally. "Years of training crews for a mission we all hoped we would never have to fly. Years of keeping a project this size hidden from a galaxy full of species, with sensors far better than they ever let on. Years of every person aboard this ship accepting that if we were ever called into action, it likely meant something had already gone very wrong back home." I thought about that, about the quiet sacrifice buried inside every calm word she spoke. It wasn't just a ship. It was a promise kept by people who never wanted to have to keep it. "That's a good way to put it," she said. "I might use that, Commander." We reached a long viewing gallery near the ship's forward section, its windows looking out over the curve of Threll Station, and the system's modest, rising sun beyond it. I stood there beside Captain Brooks, looking back at the very place where, less than a day earlier, I had sat in a council chamber and listened to my entire species be called an unfinished experiment. It felt like a lifetime ago already. The peace did not last as long as I had hoped. I was still aboard the Oracle's deck, standing in that viewing gallery with Captain Brooks, when an alert chimed sharply through the ship's internal speakers, the tone unmistakably different from the calm, routine sounds I had grown used to over the past hour. Brooks's posture changed instantly, the easy warmth in her expression replaced by something sharper, more focused. "Bridge, report," she said into a nearby comm panel. A voice answered immediately, tight with urgency. "Captain, we have an unidentified vessel approaching from outside the station's normal traffic lanes. No transponder signal, no response to hailing. Trajectory suggests it is attempting to close on the station's lower docking ring undetected." I felt the calm of the last hour evaporate instantly. Brooks was already moving, gesturing for me to follow as she strode toward the ship's bridge with long, purposeful steps. "Species identification," she called out as we walked. "Working on it now, Captain. Energy signature suggests Drathan design, though there's no record of any Drathan vessel registered to this system." I had heard of the Drathan before, a smaller, fiercely independent species who had never fully accepted compact authority and who had publicly criticized the Council's earlier vote against humanity as far too lenient, arguing that even provisional status gave us more credit than we deserved. If they were the ones approaching the station uninvited, their intentions were unlikely to be peaceful. We reached the bridge, a wide, quiet space filled with soft blue light and rows of crew stations, each one focused entirely on the unfolding situation. Brooks dropped into the command chair without hesitation, and I found myself standing just behind her, watching the main display as it resolved a grainy, distant image of the approaching vessel, sleek and angular, clearly built for speed rather than diplomacy. "Hail them again," Brooks ordered. "Full translation array, every common dialect we have on file." "No response, Captain," came the reply a moment later. "They're not slowing down." I leaned forward slightly. "Captain, if they're heading for the lower docking ring, what's down there?" "Civilian quarters, mostly," she said, her jaw tight, "including several delegations still finishing relocation after last night's session. If that ship is carrying anything dangerous, that's exactly where it would do the most damage." My mind raced through the implications. If the Drathan vessel struck the station now, mere hours after the new treaty had been signed, it would shatter the fragile peace before it had any chance to take hold. And worse, it would hand every skeptical delegation in the galaxy a perfect excuse to claim that humanity's intervention had only made the situation more dangerous, not less. "We can't let that happen," I said. Brooks did not look away from the display. Agreed, but I'm not authorized to fire on an unidentified vessel inside a civilian station's debris field, not after everything we just secured. One mistake here undoes all of it just as fast as it was won. Then what's the plan? She allowed herself a small, grim smile. We make them choose to stop, the same way we made the council choose to listen. She issued a series of rapid commands, and I watched on the display as a section of the Oracle's Det's hull, far smaller than the massive weapon bays from the night before, opened smoothly to release a single sleek shuttle, considerably faster and more maneuverable than anything I had seen humanity field before. It shot forward on an intercept course, cutting between the approaching Drathan vessel and the station's lower ring with a precision that left almost no room for error. "That's Lieutenant Grace Ellison's interceptor," Brooks said, answering my unspoken question. "Best pilot I've got. If anyone can convince them to reconsider without a shot fired, it's her." The bridge fell into tense silence as we watched the two ships close the distance between them, the Drathan vessel showing no sign of slowing despite the interceptor now matching its course directly in front of it. A new voice crackled over the comm, calm, but carrying an edge of focused intensity. "This is Lieutenant Ellison, broadcasting on all Drathan frequencies. You are on a collision course with a populated docking structure. I am authorized to disable your vessel if you do not alter course in the next 30 seconds. This is not a request." 10 seconds of silence followed, the longest 10 seconds I had experienced since the council vote itself. Then, finally, a response came through, distorted and clipped, but unmistakably present. "This is Captain Wren, of the free vessel Karvosh. We carry no weapons capable of harming your station. We sought only to dock and demand recognition before your council, the same recognition you forced from them for your own species last night." I exhaled slowly, some of the tension draining out of my shoulders, though not all of it. Brooks did not relax quite as quickly. "Lieutenant, confirm their cargo and weapons status before allowing any further approach," she ordered. "Confirming now," Ellison replied. "Scans show no weapon systems beyond standard point defense. Cargo hold appears to contain personnel only, Captain. I count 6 life signs aboard." Brooks considered this for a long moment, then opened a direct channel of her own. "Captain Wren, this is Captain Brooks of the Oracle's Det. Your approach vector and lack of response to hailing made your intentions appear hostile. I understand your frustration with the Council, but this was not the way to address it." There was a pause before Wren answered, his voice quieter now, almost embarrassed. "We feared we would not be heard any other way. Your species proved last night that silence alone is not enough. We hoped a dramatic approach might earn us the same attention." I stepped forward slightly, unable to stay quiet. "Captain Wren, this is Commander Daniel Hart. I understand wanting to be heard, but forcing your way toward a civilian docking ring is going to get your people labeled as a threat, not as a cause worth listening to. There are better ways to make your case." Another pause, longer this time. "Perhaps you are right, Commander," he said finally. "What do you suggest?" I glanced at Brooks, who gave a small nod, allowing me to continue. "I suggest you alter course, dock at the designated diplomatic bay instead, and request a formal hearing through proper channels. I will personally vouch that your approach, while alarming, was not an attack, if you stand down immediately." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like a held breath before violence, and more like genuine consideration. "Agreed," Wren said finally. "Altering course now. And Commander, thank you for choosing to listen rather than simply react." I watched on the display as the Drathan vessel slowly banked away from its original heading, falling into a new approach pattern that would bring it toward the diplomatic bay rather than the civilian ring. Beside it, Lieutenant Ellison's interceptor maintained position, escorting rather than threatening now, until both ships disappeared from the immediate sensor range, bound for a far less dramatic arrival than the one that had nearly unfolded. Brooks finally allowed herself to relax slightly in her chair, letting out a long breath. That was closer than I would have liked, 2 crises in one morning. I managed a tired laugh. I'm starting to think calm mornings are not going to be common for a while. "Get used to it, Commander," she said, though not unkindly. "Last night didn't end anything. It just changed what kind of mornings we're going to have from now on." I thought about that as the bridge slowly returned to its quieter rhythm around us. Crew members standing down from their stations, the tension in the room easing but not fully disappearing. She was right. I realized. Nothing about what had happened in that council chamber, or in the hours since, represented an ending. It was a beginning, one that would require the same patience and precision we had shown tonight, applied again and again, for as long as it took the rest of the galaxy to understand that humanity's silence had never meant weakness, only restraint, and that restraint, once spent, did not return easily to where it had been before. By the time I returned to Threll Station aboard the same shuttle that had carried me out, word of the Drathan incident had already spread through the diplomatic corridors, twisted and reshaped a dozen different ways depending on who was telling it. Some versions painted it as another act of human aggression. Others, closer to the truth, described it as proof that the new balance of power could resolve a crisis without bloodshed, faster and more cleanly than the old council ever had. Ambassador Doyle met me at the transport bay, his expression unreadable as always, though I caught the faintest trace of approval in his eyes when I gave him a full account of what had happened. "You made the right call, Commander," he said once I finished, choosing to talk to Wren instead of letting Lieutenant Ellison's interceptor make the decision for you. I almost didn't, I admitted. For about 10 seconds, I thought we were watching the whole night fall apart before it even had a chance to settle. "That feeling doesn't go away," he said. "Not even after 30 years of doing this work. You just learn to act clearly despite it." We walked together through the station's main concourse, and I noticed something had shifted in the way other delegates looked at us now. Where yesterday there had been open mockery, today there was caution, even a kind of wary respect, the look given to a known quantity rather than an unpredictable variable. A pair of Carthian officers we passed actually inclined their heads slightly as we walked by, a gesture I had never once seen offered to a human delegation before. "It's strange," I said quietly. "Less than a day ago they were laughing at us. Now they can barely meet our eyes." Doyle nodded slowly. "Respect built on fear is fragile, Commander. It will not hold forever on its own. What we do with the years that follow today is what will decide whether it becomes something sturdier." I considered his words as we reached the main council hall once more, now quiet and mostly empty after the chaos of the overnight session. A small group of station staff were already at work, removing the temporary emergency seating that had been brought in for the reconvened vote, restoring the chamber to its usual formal arrangement, as if trying to erase any visible trace of how dramatically the balance within those walls had shifted overnight. Soray was waiting near the chamber entrance when we arrived, along with a young Vexaid I had not seen before, carrying a data slate filled with what looked like an enormous volume of incoming messages. "Ambassador Doyle," she said, falling into step beside us. "I thought you should know. Reaction to last night's events is already spreading well beyond this system. Every compact world with a relay connection has received some version of the news by now." "And the reaction?" Doyle asked. "Mixed," she admitted. "Some species are framing it as humanity's overdue rise to equal status, long deserved and finally claimed. Others are calling it a dangerous precedent, exactly the kind of escalation the Council was originally formed to prevent." I felt a flicker of unease at that. Are we going to face more incidents like the one with the Drathan vessel? Other species testing where the new boundaries actually sit? Soray considered the question carefully before answering. "Almost certainly, yes," she said. "Power rarely settles quietly after it changes hands this quickly. There will be more tests, Commander, from species hoping to find weakness in what you demonstrated last night, and from species hoping simply to claim the same leverage for themselves." Doyle did not seem surprised by this. "Then we will meet each test as it comes," he said, "the same way we met this one. Carefully, and without losing sight of why we built the ship in the first place." "Which was?" He turned to look at me directly, his expression serious in a way I had rarely seen from him. "Not conquest, Commander. Never that. We built it so that no council, anywhere, would ever again feel comfortable deciding our worth without our consent. Last night proved that point. It did not erase the responsibility that comes with having proved it." I understood what he meant, even if the full weight of it would take time to settle properly. Power, once demonstrated, could not simply be set aside and forgotten. It would shape every conversation humanity had with the rest of the galaxy from this point forward, for better or worse, and the choices we made in the months and years ahead would determine which of those outcomes ultimately prevailed. Soray's young aide stepped forward hesitantly, addressing Doyle directly for the first time. "Ambassador, There is one more matter requiring your attention before the morning session formally closes. Several delegations have submitted requests for private meetings with the human delegation, beginning as early as this afternoon. Doyle allowed himself a small, tired smile. It seems we are suddenly very popular, Commander. I managed a short laugh, despite the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. After yesterday, I'm not sure popular is the word I'd choose. Diplomacy rarely lets you choose the words, he said. Only how you respond to them. Come, we have a great deal of work ahead of us, and very little time before this system stops being the most important place in the galaxy, and someone else's crisis takes its place instead. We walked together back toward the temporary offices set aside for our delegation, the station humming quietly around us, alive with 1,000 small conversations, carrying the news of what had happened to every corner it could reach. I caught fragments of it as we passed, voices speaking in languages I did not understand, all of them carrying the same unmistakable undertone of uncertainty, of a galaxy recalibrating itself around a species it had badly underestimated for far too long. I thought about the laughter from yesterday's chamber, how easily it had rolled down through those tears, how certain everyone there had been that humanity would simply accept whatever terms were handed to us. I thought about the silence that had replaced it, less than a day later, heavier, and far more honest than the laughter had ever been. Dawn had come and gone, and with it, every assumption this galaxy had built about us over 30 long years had been reduced to nothing more than ash, scattered and gone, leaving only the question of what we intended to build in its place. The private meetings Soray's aide had warned us about began that same afternoon, and they did not stop for the better part of 3 days. I sat in on most of them, watching delegation after delegation arrive at our temporary offices with carefully prepared statements that all seemed to circle the same unspoken question, whether humanity intended to use what we had demonstrated as a foundation for partnership or as the opening move of something far more dangerous. Ambassador Doyle answered each one with the same patient consistency, never raising his voice, never offering more than the new treaty already guaranteed, and never once allowing the conversation to drift toward threat or intimidation. By the third day, I began to understand that this restraint was, in its own way, exactly as important as the silent weapon bays had been the night the Oracle's dead arrived. Power demonstrated once could open a door. Only patience, applied consistently afterward, could keep that door from slamming shut again, out of renewed fear. It was during a brief pause between meetings, late on the third day, that Captain Brooks requested a final audience before her ship's scheduled departure. We met her in a smaller conference room near the docking bay, the formal atmosphere of the council chamber, replaced by something quieter and more direct. "Ambassador, Commander," she said, nodding to each of us in turn. "Fleet Command has confirmed our withdrawal window. We depart within the hour." "So soon?" I asked, surprised at how much the news unsettled me. Brooks allowed a small, knowing smile. The longer a ship like mine sits visible in a system, the more it becomes a target for exactly the kind of incident we avoided 3 days ago. Better to withdraw while the peace is still fresh, before someone decides to test it again on a larger scale. Doyle nodded slowly, clearly having expected this. "Understood, Captain. Is there anything you require before departure?" "Only your confirmation that the treaty holds," she said. "My crew did not fly this mission lightly. I would like to know it secured something lasting before we head home." Doyle considered the question carefully, the way he considered every question that mattered. "I cannot promise it will hold without challenge," he said honestly. "What I can promise is that we will defend it with the same patience your crew showed 3 nights ago, for as long as it takes the rest of this galaxy to believe we mean it." Brooks seemed satisfied with that answer, the kind of honest uncertainty that meant more, I suspected, than any easy guarantee could have offered. I walked her back toward the docking bay myself, the two of us falling into an easy quiet as we moved through corridors that had, only days earlier, felt thick with hostility, and now carried something closer to cautious normalcy. "Can I ask you something, Captain?" I said as we neared the bay entrance. "Go ahead, Commander." "Were you ever afraid, that night, holding those weapon bays open with no idea how the Council would respond?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "Every second of it," she admitted. "Fear doesn't disappear just because you've trained for something. It just stops being the only thing in the room with you." That night, there was also purpose and trust in the people who built the plan, and enough discipline to hold the line even while the fear was still there. That combination is usually enough, if you've trained for it properly. I thought about that answer for a long time after she boarded her shuttle, and the bay doors sealed behind her, carrying her back toward the ship that had, in a single night, rewritten the terms of an entire galaxy's relationship with my species. I stood at the station's main viewport an hour later, alongside Ambassador Doyle and, surprisingly, Soray as well, watching the Oracle's det begin its slow departure from orbit. There was no dramatic display this time, no weapon bays opening, no tense silence stretching across every open channel. It simply turned, gracefully and without hurry, and began the long climb back toward open space, its dark hull catching the last light of Threll's sun, before it folded smoothly into transit and vanished from sight entirely, as quietly as it had arrived. "It's strange," Soray said softly, watching the empty space where the ship had been only moments earlier. "Something that large should feel less impossible to lose track of." "That's rather the point of it," Doyle said. "A weapon that announces itself constantly stops being useful the moment everyone stops being afraid of the announcement. A weapon that only appears when it is truly needed, never loses that power at all." I considered his words carefully, watching the stars settle back into their familiar, undisturbed pattern beyond the glass. A small, strange thought occurred to me then, one I had been turning over since the moment that first secret message had arrived 3 nights earlier. "Sir," I said quietly, "do you think we'll ever have to do this again? Bring that ship out of hiding, I mean." Doyle was silent for a long moment before answering, his eyes still fixed on the dark beyond the viewport. "I hope not, Commander," he said finally. "But hope is not a strategy, and I would be lying if I told you I believed this was the last time humanity's patience will be tested by someone certain it has limits. The galaxy is large, and memory in it is short. Some species will forget what happened here within a generation. Others will remember it far too well, and resent us for it instead of respecting it." I let that settle over me, heavy but not unwelcome, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of exactly what kind of future we had stepped into the moment that ship dropped silently into orbit 3 nights ago. Soray glanced at me, something almost gentle in her expression despite her usually composed demeanor. "For what it is worth, Commander," she said, "I believe your species chose the harder path that night. It would have been easier to fire first and force the Council into submission through fear alone. You chose restraint instead, even with every advantage in your hands. That choice will matter more than the ship itself, in the long run." I held on to her words as the 3 of us stood there a while longer, watching the quiet turn of the system beyond the glass, the same stars that had witnessed our humiliation in that council chamber 2 days earlier, now witnessing something else entirely, something steadier, something that felt, against every expectation I had carried into this assignment, like the genuine beginning of an equal place among the stars, rather than the ending of one final desperate gamble. Dawn had come and gone, and with it, every old treaty that had once defined humanity's smallness in this galaxy had burned away to nothing, leaving only the harder, slower work of building something sturdier to stand in its place. I understood, standing there in that quiet observation deck, that the real story had not ended with the ship's silent withdrawal at all. It had only just begun, and whatever tests still waited for us further out among those stars, I found myself ready, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to meet them standing as an equal, rather than as a guest, waiting nervously to be allowed back to the table. The work that followed in the weeks after the Oracle's det departed taught me something the standoff itself never could, that holding power quietly is far harder than seizing it loudly in the first place. I remained on Threll Station as part of the permanent human delegation, now formally seated at the defense table we had been denied only days earlier, and I quickly discovered that the chamber's silence toward us had not vanished, only changed shape. Where once they had laughed openly, now the other delegations measured every word before speaking it, watching our reactions the way sailors watch a darkening sky, alert for any sign of the storm returning. I found this new caution almost harder to sit through than the mockery had been. Mockery, at least, was honest about what it thought of us. This careful, watchful silence felt like waiting for a mistake that would justify everyone's worst fears all over again. Ambassador Doyle warned me about this on my second week seated at that table, during a quiet moment between formal sessions. "They are not testing our strength anymore, Commander," he said. They already know what that looks like. Now they are testing our character, to see whether the species that built a weapon like that can also be trusted to set it aside. I asked him how we were supposed to prove something like that to an entire galaxy at once. One small decision at a time, he said. There is no grand gesture large enough to do it in a single stroke. Trust rebuilt slowly is the only kind that actually holds. I carried his words with me through every meeting that followed, through trade negotiations with species who had voted against us only days earlier, through quiet diplomatic dinners where conversation remained stiff and careful, long after the formal business concluded, through small disputes between minor delegations that the Council now, for the first time, actually invited our input on resolving. None of it carried the dramatic weight of that first terrible night, and I came to understand that this was precisely the point. The real measure of what we had won was not found in another dramatic standoff, but in the steady accumulation of ordinary moments where humanity was simply allowed to participate as an equal, without spectacle, without fear driving the room. Saray and I found ourselves working together more often than either of us probably expected, given how our acquaintance had begun. She had taken it upon herself, quietly and without much fanfare, to help guide our delegation through the unwritten customs and expectations of compact diplomacy that no treaty document could fully capture. I asked her once, during a long evening spent reviewing trade proposals neither of us found particularly interesting, why she bothered. Because the alternative frightens me more than helping you does, she admitted, setting down the data slate she had been studying. A galaxy where humanity feels permanently isolated, always suspected, always treated as something to be managed rather than understood, is a galaxy that will eventually force your species back toward the same choice that brought that ship into our orbit in the first place. I would rather spend my remaining years helping prevent that than watching it happen again from a safer distance. I found her honesty disarming, the kind of clear-eyed practicality that made trust easier to extend than I had expected, given how recently she had voted to humiliate us in that very chamber. Lieutenant Ellison, the pilot who had talked the Drathan captain into standing down, transferred briefly to the station several weeks later as part of a broader effort to formalize new defense protocols between our forces and the Compact's standing fleet. I met with her more than once during that assignment, and she told me something during one of those conversations that stayed with me long after she returned to active duty. Everyone keeps asking me what it felt like, flying that intercept, she said. They want a story about courage, about facing down a possible attack without flinching. The truth is far less exciting. I was terrified the entire time. I just didn't let the fear make the decision for me. I told her that sounded like the same lesson Captain Brooks had tried to teach me, about purpose and discipline outweighing fear without ever fully replacing it. Brooks taught most of us that lesson, one way or another, Ellison said with a small, fond smile. It's probably the only reason any of us managed to hold position that night without making a mistake we couldn't take back. Word eventually reached us, weeks later, that Captain Wren of the Drathan vessel Karvash had followed through on the formal hearing I had suggested during our brief, tense exchange near the station's docking ring. His petition for greater recognition within compact proceedings did not succeed entirely, not in a single session, but it opened a door that had not existed before, a process rather than a confrontation. Exactly the outcome I had hoped for when I asked him to alter course rather than force the issue through speed and silence. I thought of that exchange often in the months that followed, turning it over alongside everything else that had happened during those 3 extraordinary days. It struck me eventually that the entire arc of the crisis, from the laughter in that chamber, to the silent standoff above the station, to the quiet diplomatic grind that followed, all of it traced the same essential shape. Power alone had never been the point. It had only ever been the thing required to finally earn a seat at a table that should have been offered freely, long before any of it became necessary. On the evening marking 1 full month since the council vote that had started everything, I returned to the observation deck where this entire story had truly begun, standing once more at that long viewport, watching the same quiet stars turn slowly overhead. Ambassador Doyle joined me there, just as he had that first impossible night, though this time, his posture carried none of the tension I remembered from before. "It's quieter now," I said. "Quieter doesn't mean settled," he replied, though without the grim edge his voice had carried weeks earlier. It means the loudest part is over. The rest of it, we build one ordinary day at a time, the same as any nation, any people, ever built anything worth keeping. I considered that for a long moment, watching the distant light of a star I still did not know the name of, somewhere far beyond the edge of a system that had once decided, with a single dismissive vote, that humanity did not deserve a voice in its own future. We earned that voice the hard way, I said finally. Doyle nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the dark beyond the glass. We did, Commander. Let's make certain we spend it wisely enough that no one ever feels the need to take it from us again. I stood there beside him a while longer, watching the stars, thinking about everything that had changed in a single relentless night, and everything still left to prove in all the quiet, unremarkable days that would follow it. Somewhere out past the edge of that system, an 11-kilometer ship sat waiting once more in the dark yards where it had been built, patient as it had always been, hopefully never needed again, but ready all the same, carrying within its silent hull the simple, unshakable truth that humanity's patience, once spent, would never again be mistaken for weakness by anyone foolish enough to test it.